When it first came out, The Matrix was heavily praised not only for all of its revolutionary action and bullet time techniques, but also for the many philosophical questions it presents. It's actually a very deep movie when you stop and think about it, asking questions ranging from artificial intelligence to what freedom really is to even what we perceive to be reality. And a major reason none of the sequels have done nearly as well is because they either failed to keep asking questions or those questions became way too convoluted. And today, rather than talking about anything regarding the movie itself, I'd like to explore one of these questions in detail, specifically one posed by Cypher when it's revealed that he's the traitor. But before we get into it, I would just like to give my obligatory warning about spoilers, even though I already gave a pretty big one away. So if you haven't seen this movie and somehow don't know what happens, you should probably click away now before anything else is spoiled. Okay, so to get right into it, what I specifically want to talk about is a quote by Cypher when he's summing up why he's betraying Morpheus and the others. With that line being, I know that steak doesn't exist. I know that when I put it in my mouth, the Matrix is telling my brain that it is juicy and delicious. After 9 years, you know what I realize? Ignorance is bliss. Basically, he's saying he'd rather live a comfortable lie than an uncomfortable truth. But considering how hard living that uncomfortable truth is for him, living on a cold ship with only disgusting slop to eat, and your life in constant danger, who could really blame him? Even the movie doesn't necessarily treat his viewpoint as wrong, just the little fact that he was willing to condemn humanity to eternal slavery and kill all of his friends so he could go back to living that lie. But putting that aside for a moment, is Cypher really wrong in thinking this way? Is he really unjustified in wanting to leave humanity in the dust for his own personal comfort? After all, he didn't start the war between the humans and machines, he didn't scorch the sky, and he clearly didn't know what he was getting himself into when he took the red pill. And when looking at it from this perspective, one could argue that it was humanity who condemned themselves to this fate, and that Cypher never asked to be a part of it and shouldn't be blamed for not wanting to pay for the consequences or try and fix the mistakes of other people. Only that's a somewhat flawed point of view, because while it's true that he didn't start any of that, that doesn't mean he doesn't have a responsibility to other people or humanity as a whole. Morpheus saw his potential in being able to free humanity from enslavement, and he was the one who chose to go down the rabbit hole, as it were. Now, sure, one could argue that Morpheus shouldn't have been so vague, but unlike Cypher, he has the best interests of humanity at heart, and anything he does is in service of that alone. And what Cypher fails to see is that his talents that Morpheus values so highly should be used responsibly to help others. He could be one of the greatest heroes of all time and save humanity from the machines, but he doesn't want any of that. Instead, all he cares about is his own personal comfort, and even though he can accept the truth, he decides that he'd rather live a lie, no matter the consequences, because it's more comfortable for him. In other words, Morpheus sees his and his team's suffering as humanity's gain, while Cypher sees his suffering as accomplishing nothing but making him miserable. And to put it even more simply, Cypher ultimately rejects the responsibility his talents impose upon him and instead opts to run away from his past choices, and all of humanity almost pays the price for it. But that quote could also present an even more basic question. Is ignorance truly bliss? I mean, I won't deny that when it comes to the context of the movie, some people would definitely say so. But what about on the whole? Is logic really an enemy and truth a menace, like Rod Serling once said, and that we're better off being left in the dark when it comes to certain things? Well, to start to answer that question, I would just like to point out that that quote about logic and truth actually comes from a story of Serling's, and that in context, it's actually put in a negative light. Basically, he's saying that it's wrong for people to think this way, and that anybody who does is ultimately either a dictator or a mindless slave at best, and a moron who refuses to reflect on self-improvement in any way at worst. Because here's the thing. That phrase only applies to the person who's being ignorant. It may be bliss for them, but not for anybody else. And to use the Matrix as an example, everybody plugged into the Matrix may be blissfully unaware of the truth and live somewhat comfortable lives. But for Morpheus and everybody else who knows the truth, they're just drones to be used by the enemy. And the more of them are ignorant, the bigger a problem it is for them. Because the thing is, ignorance is just as much an enemy as ill intent or an active desire to do evil. There have been so many problems caused throughout human history, so many issues made way worse, and so many lives lost because of other people's ignorance. In truth, it can only lead to good things for the person who's choosing to be ignorant. And even then, half the time, it ultimately comes back to bite them in the end. After all, there's a reason Charles Dickens says in A Christmas Carol that ignorance is something that should be extremely wary of and avoid at all costs, because in the end, it benefits no one, usually not even the individual indulging in it. And there's also the fact that what you're ignorant to may not be as bad as it seems, and not worth the stress of not knowing about it. I mean, given the stress of the real world, you can't tell me, no matter how few people there would be who would actually be relieved to learn the truth about the Matrix, if only because they'd no longer have to be burdened with all the responsibilities of a society similar to our own. But for a more reasonable example, there are so many times in our lives when we choose not to know something, even though it might turn out to be not nearly as bad as we think it is. We're just that afraid of bad news, or that the absolute worst will always be the case in any given scenario. I speak from personal experience when I say sometimes it is better to know. I won't get into specifics, but not too long ago I heard about something, and while I had decided that I wanted to know nothing about it, it was still bothering me for days. But when I finally did look into it, I found that it was much better than I expected it to be, and that burden was finally lifted completely. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that sometimes the truth is better than the feeling of not knowing, because ignorance also comes with uncertainty, doubt, and speculation, and a wild imagination running away with you. The truth, no matter how bad it is, at least provides a definitive answer. And as I was just trying to point out, more often than not, it turns out to be a lot better, or at least not nearly as bad, as what you were expecting. Okay, so in case you're wondering what the heck my point here is, it's that ignorance may be bliss, but only for Cypher himself. His decision to betray his friends comes from him refusing to accept his duty or responsibility towards humanity, or even the consequences of his own choices. And his willingness to accept that ignorance once more almost spells doom for humanity, which beautifully demonstrates how ignorance may seem inviting, but will only lead to disaster. And really, it's quite a credit to the Matrix that this is only one aspect of the movie, and that pretty much only a single line and the implications of a few other scenes could spark such an intense philosophical discussion. Because as I briefly touched on at the beginning, there's plenty of other philosophical arguments that could be unpacked from this movie. But I think I'll just leave you guys with my thoughts on what I've said for the moment. Alright, that pretty much ends this video. And sorry if it seemed to be a little all over the place and a little different from my normal videos, but I just felt that this was a subject worth bringing up, if only to demonstrate how a well-written story can derive discussion from even the smallest of lines or actions. But, for the moment anyway, I digress, and would instead like to hear what you have to say. Do you believe Cypher was running away from his responsibilities in wanting to get plugged back into the Matrix and perfectly demonstrates that his ignorance is everybody else's misery? Or do you believe that he was somewhat justified in feeling the way he did? Or maybe even a bit of both? Please let me know what you think in the comments below. And you don't have to agree with this video if you don't want to. If you think I'm wrong about everything I said, that's fine. And I've got no problems with you if you do. And finally, thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.